to give my honest opinion of this movie. It's actually not that bad. I enjoyed it. The first time that I had come across this movie, it was from a late night show which mocked the movie for being a copycat of Godzilla or something like that. After many years from the first exposure, I decided to watch it now. And yeah, it's actually not bad. There is surprisingly a plot twist in this movie, and a story that has a motive that influences the choices and the decisions of the characters of the story. And as you may know, I'm sure other people have mentioned it in their videos, this movie was made in North Korea. However, the people who had made the movie itself had been kidnapped from South Korea or misled from other countries to make this movie. And the point that I want to make with this is that it didn't feel like North Korean propaganda. In fact, I found myself laughing at times during this movie because I couldn't stop comparing it to the ironies of what was happening in this movie, such as people in power being corrupt, people in power forcing farmers to starve, people in power stealing equipment from farmers. There's just so many. However, there was a reason for showing all this. The story of this was about the regular everyday farmers or citizens being forced against their will from the governor and the king to give up their equipment so that they could use the iron to make weapons to fight against bandits that were rebelling against the government. Quite ironic. But without too many politics aside, and now wanting to give my opinion of this movie, let's begin on the things that I liked about this movie, the things I disliked, my final thoughts, and a conclusion. What do I like about this movie? I liked a lot of things about this movie, whether it would be the story, the action scenes, or the drama. The one thing that I did enjoy the most was that it just got straight to the point. It didn't dive too deep into the character developments of the people that were the main characters of the movie, because spoilers, they all die. But I felt like this way of writing sort of worked in this movie. For example, the plot of this movie, which is about the farmers rebelling against the government for taking all the iron so they could use it to make weapons to deal with the rebellious bandits. Ironic. Of course, the villagers are against this, and it leads to many being captured by the soldiers and imprisoned. During this imprisonment, an old man who failed to obey gives his final prayer to summon Pulgasari, in which he had made out of rice from his daughter and his son, who had thrown it into his jail cell. After his death, his daughter finds the model of Pulgasari and goes home with it. Then while she was sewing, she accidentally pokes herself with a needle, and the blood drips into Pulgasari, and Pulgasari comes to life. Pulgasari then grows bigger and bigger from this moment as he consumes metal. The more he consumes, the bigger he gets, which becomes a big problem for the guards as he stops an execution from being performed and ends up eating the garrison's stock of weaponry. While the conflict was happening in the background between the governor's army and the farmers, Pulgasari becomes big and saves the daughter of the old man from the soldiers. Pulgasari then becomes a fighting monster among the farmers as they begin to collect more iron tools and weapons and feed Pulgasari, who then eventually becomes a giant who serves the freedom of the farmers from the torture that the king and the government had brought upon him. Pulgasari is unstoppable, as no weapon was able to pierce its iron body. Even during the attempts the king's army had made to end Pulgasari, it had always come back and destroyed everything the king's army had thrown at him. Eventually, Pulgasari kills the king and the palace of the governors, and the farmers were finally free from the government and could do whatever they pleased. But then there was a new problem. What was next? The farmers had finally gotten what they wanted, freedom from the government. They were no longer forced to bow down to a governor or a king. They were free. But the only problem now was that the giant monster who had served their purpose no longer had any iron or metal left for food, as the king's military was no more. So then, the farmers began to gather all of their own iron and metal to feed Pulgasari, as they didn't want Pulgasari to go hungry. After everything the farmers had been through, they wanted to give their thanks to the monster who had saved them from the king and the government. So with this story, it felt like it worked well without the need to have too much character development, which is pretty basic to be honest. The purpose of the old man was for him to want to have a normal peaceful life as a farmer. The young man was someone who had wanted to venture into the mountains to deliver materials, and the daughter was someone who was out for vengeance for the death of her father. There wasn't too much character being involved with this movie, and to be honest, I think it worked well with this movie. I felt like it was made to be focused on the story and the drama. I think with how the pacing went, it wanted to show us the beginning and the end, the reason for the rebellion, and the end of what was achieved, giving the story of the farmer's struggle and overthrowing the king while using Pulgasari, and then the problem with what's next, what comes after the overthrowing of the king. where they're now left with a situation that was almost like what they had started with. The problem of giving up their freedom to then serve something that is greater or above them in power. At the beginning, they were serving the governor and the king, being forced to give up their tools so that the governor could make weapons to squash a rebellion. But after the overthrowing of the king, they were left in a situation where they had to give up their tools and equipment to Pulgasari, as Pulgasari could only survive on eating metals, and the farmers were forcing themselves to give up this equipment because they didn't want Pulgasari to starve. And I think that's the reason why I like this. The story just got to the point. I believe it wanted to show us that even after the farmers were free, they would eventually end up in a situation that they would need to serve something else and give up the valuable things that they initially were against, but only this time choosing to do so freely, leaving them in the cycle that is never ending. Still, a pretty clever story, even though the whole thing could have been prevented if the king and the government weren't as corrupt. But yeah, so I felt like it didn't really need too much character. The story went from one thing to the next, and yeah, it just got to the point. However, this is gonna be ironic. It's also something that could be considered dislikable. What do I dislike about this movie? Speaking of ironies, there wasn't enough character development. Even though I already said that what I liked about it is that the story gets to the point and tells the motives. But while writing the script for this video, I did stop and think about it for a second, and I thought, oh yeah, there isn't actually much character development in this movie. Let's give an example. The beginning of the movie had a subtle motive of the old man wanting to marry his daughter off to a young man, but the events that came afterwards then completely discards the relationship between the young man and the woman. And even during the movie, we don't see the young man and the woman form a bond between each other. There doesn't seem to be a connection between the two, and the potential idea that the two could become love interests doesn't develop any further after the first scenes of the movie. This is probably one example that I can think of, because the beginning of the movie sort of felt like they were going to lead down that way. The lead male and female love story that would show us the connection between the two while there is chaos around them. And after all this chaos, the two would live happily ever after and move on to a peaceful life. But no, instead, spoilers by the way, they both actually die. Yeah, this movie doesn't play into the happily ever after stuff that you would usually see in most Hollywood movies. So then the character dynamics between the two doesn't get developed. In fact, for most of the time, the two don't really talk to each other that much. Instead, they're too focused on what is in front of them, which is the motive of taking down the governor and the king, and using Pulgasari as a weapon for themselves to turn the battles into their favor. And every now and then, they would talk to each other in situations that would be necessary, such as looking for food or becoming their own militia or saving Pulgasari. There really isn't too much character development in this movie. Although I said it was a good thing, which it is, don't get me wrong, but I can also see it as a downside, which is quite ironic. That's really all I dislike, to be honest. Final thoughts. Now, I would like to mention one last point, which is going back to my explanation of this movie. What happens next? Pulgasari helped the farmers defeat the king, and now the farmers have to keep Pulgasari alive, and they begin giving up their resources freely to keep Pulgasari fed, which is an irony. The one thing that the farmers were against, they were freely doing it, even though they know that it wasn't good for them in the long term. So then the story shifts to the farmers freely burdening themselves with the same problems as before, and Pulgasari was something that really had no use for the people. The daughter of the old man then realizes all this, and with her fear,
그렇게도 고마운 구세주였던 내가 하루아침에 이렇게 무서운 원수를 될 줄이. 이제 이 나라엔 쇠붙이가 들창이 날 테지. 그땐 사람들이 널 앞세우고 남의 나라를 침범하지 않을 수 없을 게다. 온 세상이 모두 전쟁 마당으로 화를 깨고 세상은 망한다.
She ends up sacrificing herself to Pulgasari, which ends the life of the monster and herself as well, so that the farmers could no longer have the need to freely burden themselves over Pulgasari. To my surprise, it was extremely ironic. The farmers were initially the ones who were burdened by the king and governor of having to give up their tools so that it could be made as weapons for the governor, and with all this mess to remove the people in power, which they had achieved, they were left in another burden that had the same problems as before. The burden to give up their tools made of metal to a monster who had freed them from the suppressive government. The only difference is that this time, this decision was made by themselves and not the non-existing government. So then this motive sort of, in my opinion, says that even after achieving the success of no longer serving something suppressive, you're still left with another thing that is just as suppressive, but this time you're making the decision to do so yourself, because this thing had helped you remove the previous thing. The government is now replaced with Pulgasari, and instead of being forced to give up belongings, you're going gonna decide to freely do it because you feel bad that it helped you with so much, so you don't want it to disappear. To be honest, I can't tell if this is North Korean propaganda. I'm too used to their propaganda being very direct and obvious. But this movie was pretty clever in being able to hide that, if there was any. But it's up for interpretation, as I believe you guys should watch it yourself to form your own opinion. One last thing to add, Pulgasari destroying the buildings was actually pretty cool, not gonna lie. Hell yeah. So overall, I did enjoy this movie. It completely caught me off guard, mostly because the story was decent. It told us the motives of the farmers and the attempts made by the governor and the king to defeat Pulgasari. At times I felt like I didn't know who to cheer for, as my previous experience of watching Godzilla would tell me to cheer for the humans, as the monster was the one who was destroying the lives of people. But in this movie, there were moments where I was cheering for the soldiers, as it was the monster that was destroying the lives of the people. But then I realized that it was the farmers who were the ones who were using the monster to fight back against the soldiers. But the story overall did still tell a message that I felt like it meant something for the people of North Korea and potentially the world. But watch the movie yourself to form your own opinion, because I enjoyed it. Pretty decent movie. There you have it. That is the video. Hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you. Bye.